I think people who are going to have an issue with this change should do this mental exercise with me, because I just started doing this mental exercise and this is like immediately put me into a completely different mindset. Let me walk you through what could have happened. We learned that Blizzard was going to be adding terror zones in patch 2.5. This means that we're going to be able to farm a lot of areas at a higher value level. But the problem would have been that there are a very diverse field of immunities in the game. So they have added Sunder charms. Sunder charms are going to be a chase item that will drop in terror zones that will make it so that a monster is no longer immune to a damage type and is instead reduced to 95 resistance. Because the monster was immune, and in an attempt to comparatively buff physical damage builds, effects like Conviction and Low Resistance will still be 1/5 effective, but Amplify Damage, Decrep, and Grim Ward will be 100% effective. Facets will be 100% effective on builds that benefit from facets. Sunder charms will work for your minions and for your traps, and they were going to leave the Blizzard sorceress alone because in the endgame, the damage numbers don't look that much different. If that was the change that we were given at the beginning of this, what would the takeaway be? First off, people would still be saying that Blizzard sorceresses are, still relatively too powerful. They're always relatively too powerful. I still would have made the previous video that I did, but that definitely would have been one takeaway. Another takeaway is that a lot of elemental builds have now gained the ability to farm in a lot of areas they weren't going to be able to. And on top of that, elemental builds that already benefited from things like low resistance and infinity now benefit more. Since the monster is brought down to 95 before it's applied, previously the monster would have been at 83 resistance if we're talking about lightning immunes with infinity, but now they're at 78 resistance. So you go from doing 17% of your damage to 22% of your damage. That's a pretty big increase. It's nearly an additional 33% damage increase before you consider stuff like facets. Then when you add on facets, which are 100% effective, the damage numbers start to look better and better and better. And in fact, the cold sorceress doesn't really gain anything from the cold facets, whereas the other builds compared to their old damage output are now gaining more. It still increases the value of crap facets because the more that you can lower res, the better. So all of a sudden market value for 3/3 facets still goes up. And physical builds, which felt like they weren't really given a lot, at least are getting their 100% effectiveness from Amp, Grimward, and Decrep. So when they go into the tower level, all of a sudden they're going to be able to kill ghost monsters at pretty good speed, whereas previously they had to sit there and like individually berserk, if we're talking about the barbarian, each ghost until it died. So that, if we got it presented to us like that, it still is a really cool buff that increases the zones that we're going to be able to farm in, with the addition of zones that have now become so much more valuable that they're going to outperform old area level 85 areas. Magic builds get shafted, but magic builds face the least amount of immunities. And I think a lot of people would probably have said like, hey, that's fine. My Bone Spear Necromancer's Corpse Explosion is still going to be more effective. The Foden never really cared about immunities in the first place, so there's no way to relatively buff them, but they have gained access to more valuable zones, so that's fine. I think if you look at all of the changes now as a single package, it's actually a fairly balanced and healthy change to the overall game that still increases the viability of endgame builds that weren't the cold sorceress, as well as comparatively elevating physical builds. I think if we look at the total amount of changes as they are right now, as opposed to the piecemeal set of changes, which has absolutely tinted and jaded our overall reception of these changes, it looks a lot better. That being said, there are still some key takeaways that I think are important to note. So first and foremost, we're still only talking about immune monsters. And the reason why that's so important is because now I think you're gonna have to think more about whether or not I'm always farming terror zones, or if I should go back to my tried and true area level 85 zones if I'm trying to farm efficiently when the terror zone wouldn't be great for my build. And I tried to stress that before, but now it's become even more important. Two, since it doesn't apply to stuff like Grimward, Amplify Damage, and Decrepify, there are still a lot of builds that have become slightly more comparatively powerful. And stuff like a Singer Barbarian was already kind of feeling pretty good with the addition of Grimward, and now being able to Grimward a Ghost Pack is like kind of really, really strong. Still getting the short end of the deal. We still need to talk about hit check and how that works in the game and how to actually elevate physical damage builds, but there are options, and they feel slightly better than their elemental counterparts on less gear. The difference between Infinity and Plague has become much less noticeable. since they're only going to both apply at 1/5 effectiveness between Infinity's Conviction and Plague's lower resistance, we're talking about a difference of -17 res versus -11 res. For all intents and purposes, we're talking about a difference between an additional facet in your gear. So Plague as a mid-game, lower investment option, while it's less consistent, is still going to be such a huge boon that I definitely think that a lot of builds should try to focus on this as early as possible so that they can automate the lower res option that I talked about previously, where rather than having a lower res wand on swap, you can have more magic find or something like that, and your mercenary can handle this, and then you can worry about getting to infinity much later on in the season if you get one at all. Yes, the Cold Sorceress's relative power does extend throughout a larger portion of the competitive farming metagame for whatever that means to you, and you will be able to explore more content easier with less gear. That was always going to be true. It's now more true, and just as a secondary caveat, I no longer think that there's an argument for infinity on endgame Cold Sorceress. I apparently was one of the few people who think that it's still best in slot, which it absolutely was before this change, but the benefit out of putting an infinity on your mercenary just really isn't there anymore. That being said, I do think that Cold Blizzard Sorceress going 100 point investment with 20 points into Cold Mastery is absolutely the game plan now, and is going to carry you through all of the game content that you want. And for people who are going to touch on it very quickly, this does drastically change what elemental builds are able to do the Ubers, and the Cold Sorceress has now, in the Ubers, gained the most out of Sunder Charm changes versus the other builds. I'm not an Uber expert. I won't go into excruciating detail, but I just want to make that point because I know a lot of people were talking about that before and they were correct. But with this change to it, that is a very different story. And just this last part, facets have now gained even more relative value. Crap facets are even more important to get into your gear early. Perfect facets are even more valuable later on for builds that benefit from them. And I think that you're going to see a lot more facets and a lot more pieces of gear that you probably wouldn't have seen previously, just because of how powerful a 100% effective minus enemy res from your gear will be when we're talking about mid-game farming efficiency. So that's important. I really think that it will help a lot of people come to better rationalize what has actually happened if you look at it all as a single package, as opposed to looking at it as a piecemeal implementation of different changes that had different levels of acceptance amongst the overall meta-analysis of D2. We are still becoming stronger. We are still able to farm more areas than we ever were before. Terror zones are still going to be, in many cases, the best to farm areas for overall value from monsters. A lot of builds have now become stronger, and since you have gained more farming areas, things like Enigma have become less must-haves on a lot of builds, where just very quick mobility and killing a couple elites and then going and saving and exiting to the next game is going to be the difference between those two farming strategies is going to become much less important. And chase items like Enigma, like Griffins, like an Infinity are still going to drastically increase your overall power level in the end game. And that change helps those items to feel their appropriate amount of value, as opposed to having the overinflated amount of value that they were going to have prior to this change. I hope that that helps. I would love to hear people's opinions, trying to take it all into the same scope and look at it through a lens that takes into account all of the changes. I think the picture becomes a lot more clear, and I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.